In this lesson, we're going to be looking at a closure for JavaScript and how it interacts with the different scope chain values. So we've got the values that we have within the inner function. We have the values within the outer function, because that inner function is a child of the outer function. And then we also have the values contained within the global. And we're going to be making use of all three of these values. Even after the function has been invoked, which we're invoking over here, we can still continue to run that function and output those values. Go ahead and create an HTML file and then link it to the JavaScript. And we're going to be using the browser and the DevTools console. And this is a Chrome browser on the right-hand side. And from the web address using a live server from Visual Studio Code, which is the code editor that I'm using. And the developer console is just down here on the bottom right-hand side. I've got it linked over to a file called app6.js. So same directory, and this is the JavaScript file that we're going to be creating our example. So we're going to create an example of a closure. So we've got an outer function for the closure, and we're going to pass in a value into that outer function. And what this is going to do is a closure is a function that has access to variables in the parent scope. So even after the parent function has returned, so typically when you do run a function, you don't have access to the variables that are contained within it. So if we were to create a variable, just call it val1, and this will have a value of 10, and then we access that value in outer function, so val1, and let's output this into the console, and then we get the value of 10 being returned back. So we have access to the values, the variable values that are outside of the function, but if we were to create a new value within the function, we're not going to have actually access to it. So create a value of val2, and if we try to access it outside of the function scope, even though we're going to be running the function, we're not going to have any access to val2 because that's going to be within a different scope. That's within the curly brackets of the outer function. So what we want to do with a closure is we want to have still access to some of the content that's being run within the function itself. And this is what the closures are used for. They give us access to values that are inside of the function. So the inner function retains access to the variables even outside of the outer function's scope. So we're going to set a value here. We can just have an inner value. We'll use the val2 and then create a new function within the function. So we'll call this one innerFun. And what this is going to do is it's going to return back the value of x plus the value of the val2. So whatever value of x that we pass in here, it's going to then take the value of val2, which is going to be 10, and it's going to add x plus val2, and it's going to return that value. And that's going to be within the inner function. So we're going to have access to the inner function, and returning to the main function, we're going to invoke the inner function. So let's try this out and save the code. So we don't have a value for x, of course, yet. And we haven't invoked the function yet. So what we want to do is we want to create a closure variable, and I'll use val3. Although we could use val2 because val2 is within the scope of the outer function. And selecting the outer function, let's go ahead and we're going to pass a value of 15 into the outer function. And then within the console, let's output what we have for the result of val3. So what do you think the value is going to be when we're returning back this value? So right now it's just returning back the function code. So in order to invoke it, we need to use the rounded brackets, which will invoke that inner function, returning back the value back to our console. And this is going to be sitting within the global scope. So within this example, we're returning back a value of 25. Let's create a quick loop where we're loop through some of the values of x, while x is less than 10, and then we'll increment x. And then within here, what we want to do is we're going to just simply log out the value that we're getting returned back. So we'll run the outer function, x plus. Now, when we run this, we're not invoking the function properly. So we need to add the other set of rounded brackets. So instead of returning back the function code as a variable, we're simply running it directly within the console log. And that's giving us this incrementing value where we've got the value of x, which is incrementing by 1. So starting out at 12, because we've got a value of the default value starting at 10 of val2, and then we're incrementing it by 1. So each iteration, we're still using the value of 10, which is within the outer function scope, and we're incrementing it by 1, where we're adding the 2 to it. So that's providing these returned results. So an example, the inner function is a closure. So this function within here is the closure because it has access to the variable x and the inner variable. So it's got the variable that is being passed in as the argument into the outer function. And then it also has the inner variable. And from the outer function, even after the outer function has returned, we still have that value that we have within the inner function. And that's where we're able to run the closure. So the closure will have 3 scope chains, and it has access to its own scope. So it has access to this scope. It has access to the outer function scope. So that's where it's getting val2 and x. And then it also has access to the global scope. So we could use the variable value of val1 and also make use of that. So let's add that into our returned value there. And we have the access to the global scope variable there. So commonly used in JavaScript for a variety of tasks, such as implementing private methods and variables, creating callback functions to retain access to variables from their parent scope, creating and returning an object that has access to the variables from its parent scope. So JavaScript closures are an important concept that is important to understand how closures work in JavaScript, and it gives you a better idea of how the variable scopes work as well. And it also is important to be aware of the scope chain and how closures interact with the scope chain. So go ahead and try it out to create your own example of JavaScript closure.